Public Library's One Book, One Aurora keynote event, an evening with Jan Wong. My name is Risha Mandelkorn, and I have the pleasure of hosting what I know will be a fascinating conversation. But first, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. We are gathered virtually on the traditional lands and territory of a number of First Nations. I am speaking from the Dish with One Spoon Wampum, a covenant between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that calls upon all of us, both the original nations and those of us who are settlers and newcomers, to take no more than we need, to coexist in peace with other nations, and to ensure the continuing sustainability of the land, air, and water. Tonight, on the evening before the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, I would like to challenge everyone present to consider our own relationships with the land and engage with Indigenous struggles to restore and repair broken relationships. In that spirit, we honor all who came before us, our own ancestors, as well as the Indigenous caretakers, named and unnamed, recorded and unrecorded. This event will be recorded as part of Aurora Public Library's archive of author events. So I'm going to begin with a few opening questions to get the conversation started, and I invite you to submit your questions in the Q&A as we go along, and we'll get to as many of them as we can in our time allotment. Jan Wong went to China as a starry-eyed Maoist in 1972 at the height of the Cultural Revolution. In the name of social justice, she hauled pig manure in the paddy fields and turned in a fellow student who sought her help in getting to the United States. Jan came from a comfortable middle-class family. Her father was a well-known restaurateur who opened the first Chinese food buffet in Montreal, the upscale Bill Wong's on DeCarry Boulevard. While many young social activists at the time read and quoted from Mao's little book, at age 19, Jan left home and went to China in search of utopia, becoming one of only 2 Westerners permitted to study at Beijing University. Now, full disclosure, as a contemporary of Jan Wong, I remember her dad. I ate in the restaurant. I carried quotations from Mao in my knapsack, and I've been following her writing since her first book, Red China Blues, was published. It is my professional and personal honor to introduce writer, journalist, columnist, and professor Jan Wong. Welcome, Jan. So happy to have you with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's so exciting to know that you went to my dad's restaurant. That's really cool. And also that you carried Mao's quotations around too.
Yes, we all have our history, and I have to tell you, I do a lot of author events, but I have been so excited about this evening. I'm in for a personal treat, as is our audience. So Jan, I'm going to start off by asking you, what caused a young, self-described, spoiled kid to renounce rock and roll and take up wielding a pneumatic drill at the #1 machine tool factory?
I think there were probably 3 reasons. Since you're a contemporary, you will know, and maybe some of the people in the audience will know, that the early 70s was a radical time at North American universities. The Vietnam War was raging, and we were all protesting. And naturally, we were on the side of the downtrodden and the people. Another element in this was my ethnicity. My coming of age in Montreal was a very different society than what you see today in Toronto. It was not multicultural. And so I was a minority. I was the only Chinese in my classes. And because I looked different from others, people kept othering me, not in a mean way, but always asking me, where are you from? Where are you really from? I'd say the Montreal General, where were you born? Montreal, the Montreal General, but they wanted to know. And so they kept pushing me into the corner until I said, okay, I'm Chinese, except that I wasn't Chinese. So that combination of being pushed in the corner and being forced to declare my ethnicity as Chinese, but not knowing anything about China, made me curious uh, about the country and the language. And I should say the third element was I was really lousy in science and math. And, I think a lot of immigrants fall into the science and math because they have a language problem. Well, I didn't have a language problem, and science and math were really terrible for me. And and so I thought, how am I going to earn a living? Well, I like to ask questions. I'm good at spelling. I'm very nosy. So maybe if I go and learn Chinese, one day I can be a journalist. And so those were all the elements that pushed me. I had finished, I think I finished my third year at McGill. And in those years, it was the bridge year right after they developed the CEGEP system. So we had 5 years of university. So I went in my summer vacation. I was 19, but already, at university for several years. And so I went, wasn't even my idea. One of my McGill classmates said, let's go to China. She was Australian and a much older woman. I think she was in her early 20s and she was married. So I said, oh, okay. And we applied for our visas at the embassy in Ottawa. And she was denied a visa and I was given a visa. Why? Well, I assume because I was ethnic Chinese and she was white. And so then I had to make a decision. Do I go by myself? I don't speak Chinese. It's her idea. But on the other hand, the fact that they denied her made me feel, wow, I guess it's hard to get a visa. I guess I should go. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question. Why would I go at age 19 on my summer vacation from McGill University? It's all logical if you know all those things, but that's why I went.
So I read that you wrote, I thought I knew everything about China within a few weeks of arriving in 1972. Of course, I knew nothing and would not figure out the country for years and years. How were your ideals of equality and social justice shattered by the reality that you encountered?
Well, people who got a chance to go to China in the 70s would usually go for a 2-week trip and come home and write a whole book. That's how naive the West was about China. So I also felt like, well, I had a course at McGill. I'd read a few books and I thought I knew the country. I thought I understood it's a socialist country. And women hold up half of heaven, which meant they were equal. I felt I knew it. And so when I got there and I bumped up against the reality, I was quite shocked. So for instance, as I said, I didn't speak Chinese. So I land there. They've never seen anyone like me who looks Chinese, doesn't speak Chinese, and is traveling alone. That was really shocking for the Chinese. So, they gave me somebody who organized my touring. But because I was ethnic Chinese, I had to be taken care of by a separate travel agency than you would be taken care of. They had 2 travel agencies. They had the China International, which was for people like you, and then they had the China Travel Agency for people like me. And so the China Travel Agency didn't have any interpreters. They assumed that we all spoke Chinese. If you look like me, it had to speak Chinese, which was of course absurd, but they were just opening to the West. And they never met anyone like me who doesn't speak any Chinese. So, my guide would send me to the most boring places. And one day I met this young guy in, I think it's a zoo. And he was very handsome. And even though I had only one course at McGill of Mandarin, I was using sign language and I talked to him. And he told me, he's from the provinces. And he asked me if I wanted to go row a boat the next day. And I thought, yeah, that would be way more fun than going to another museum where I can't understand the captions or anything. And so I told my guide the next morning when she was trying to put me into a car to send me off to another boring revolutionary site, I said, no, I'm going rowing with this guy I met. And she stomps out to the front door of the hotel. And so there were 2 clues here. Chinese were not allowed into the hotel. And I was in a separate hotel from a hotel you would stay at. It was really like apartheid. It was like a triple apartheid. You stayed in the nicest hotels. I stayed in the crappy hotels, and ordinary Chinese people were not even allowed to come into our hotel. So the woman, who I thought was fantastic, she stomps out. I point out the young guy who's going to go rowing with me, and she tears a strip off him. She demands his ID, and she's yelling at him, and he looks really frightened. I don't understand what she's saying, but I know what she's saying. She's screaming at him. And so it was though I had a couple of incidents like that that really went, what is this country? Like I thought, he's a proletariat. He was a worker. He told me he was a mechanic. How come they're treating him like this? And how come I'm made to feel like I've just committed a crime by trying to meet this guy, and we're just going to go rowing in the park? So it really shocked me. And it was the beginning of a very slow awakening where you don't understand the system, you don't understand the language or the culture, but you're slowly learning it, and you're slowly meeting people, and you're slowly going, wow, this is not what I expected. So it was a really, really interesting time to be in China.
So in 1978, prompted by hints of political change, people began putting up posters on a section of wall near the Forbidden City that became known as Democracy Wall. What role do you think that foreign media had in supporting or crushing this movement for change?
Well, at the time of Democracy Wall, the first major American news organizations arrived in Beijing. Before that, we had the Globe and Mail, which had the oldest Western news bureau. We had been there since the late 50s. But in 78 and 79, the Americans were arriving. So the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, and the Associated Press, which is the wire service, they were all arriving and setting up bureaus. And so I was going down on my own to look, but I, at that time, was really trying to get into journalism. I thought, I think being a reporter is the best thing in the world. Let me see if I can get a job as a news assistant. So I applied to all of the bureaus, and the New York Times answered me right away. And you have to write them a letter. Those were the days when you wrote letters, and then they'd write you a letter back. And so I got hired by the Times, and one of my duties every day was to go past Democracy Wall and read the posters. These were, it was an old brick wall around an old bus terminal, and the character posters, they call them big character posters, and they were on pastel colored thin paper and written with a Chinese ink brush, because there were no such thing as magic markers. So people would write with black ink and handwritten, and they would be protests. They would be essays on democracy, or they would be accusations against a village party secretary. Party secretary was the head of the Communist Party in the village, accusing him of rape, or saying that he had confiscated some peasants' land. So there would be all this interesting stuff, which I'd never seen before. It was just bursting out. And so my job was to go by every day. And it was very handy because these were handwritten on colors. And I would bike past it. I had a bicycle. I could see at a glance what was new. You know, you had the visual memory of what you saw yesterday, the different colors, and then you'd suddenly go, oh, there's a pink one that wasn't there yesterday. So I would get off. And I remember many, many people wanted to read it. It was hugely popular. It was so popular, I could hardly stand it because everybody was smoking. I remember I would go there and there's like clouds of cigarette smoke, and I have to hold my breath and try to read this stuff. And then I would take notes and tell the bureau chief, Fox Butterfield, what I'd seen. So your question was, how did the media sort of encourage this or even lead to the suppression? I think it encouraged it because people who put out the posters knew they were getting amplified. And of course, it also led to the oppression because the Chinese leadership were not happy with this stuff getting out. And eventually they closed it down and they arrested people.
So it has been 33 years since hundreds of thousands of people flooded onto the streets of Beijing demanding democracy, freedom of speech, and an end to corruption. And you personally witnessed the student-led protests of June 3rd and 4th from a balcony overlooking Tiananmen Square. Can you take us back to that massacre and also to your thoughts today when reflecting on that time period?
Okay, so just so that the people listening don't get all confused, I went to China multiple trips. And the first, when I first went, I went as a student, McGill, and I studied a year. And then I came back to McGill, graduated. Then I went to China again as an exchange student sent by the Canadian government. And I did a 3-year history degree. And then I stayed, and that's when I ended up staying so long. I ended up working for the New York Times. Then I left, came back to North America, went to New York for journalism school. And my goal was to go back as a correspondent. And so I worked for a bunch of years as a business reporter for different papers. And then the Globe and Mail sent me to Beijing in 1988. So when 1989, the demonstration started, I was there as a foreign correspondent. And that was a long process. It started in April and it culminated in a massacre in June. So there were weeks of these protests. And it started with the death of a Central Committee, a Politburo member. The Politburo is the elite core of the Central Committee, and the Central Committee is kind of the ruling part of the Communist Party. So it started with the funeral of one of the top leaders, and it was a tricky way for people to be able to protest and not get squashed, because who could object to them mourning the death of a communist leader? So it was very crafty, and they came out. And the government didn't know what to do with the protests. They were really shocked. They were the first mass protests in history, in communist history, in the capital. And it's at the height, 1 million people were demonstrating in the streets. And at that time, I think Beijing had 10 million people. So 1 in 10 were marching. And it was a very exciting time. And then Gorbachev came because it was the first Sino-Soviet summit after years of estrangement and hostility, and they even fought a war on their border. So there was a huge deal for China, and Gorbachev couldn't get to any of his events because of the roads blocked by all the demonstrators. So the Chinese leadership was really mad. They felt they had lost face. It was interesting because I think Gorbachev, I mean, he died recently, and I read his obituaries, and none of them said what I thought was an important element of Gorbachev's experience. He had come to China in May of 1989, a few days before the massacre, really, and he had seen the people rising up against communism. And I think when he went back and he had this problem with the Berlin Wall, he decided a deliberate decision not to use violence. That's why he backed down. And all of this was missing from his obituaries. But I really think he was quite taken by what he saw in Beijing, because he gave press conferences and we saw this and he talked about it. He said he'd never seen anything like it. But so then after Gorbachev left, the Chinese leadership was really angry because they had lost so much face. And so they ordered martial law. And that just brought more people out. They had never imposed martial law on the Chinese capital before. So just galvanized everybody. And it led to this big confrontation on June 4th. People didn't realize that they were going to get shot because they had gone through, I think, 7 weeks of protests. And they just thought they would actually win. They were getting a lot of international media attention because all the world's media came for the Sino-Soviet summit, the Gorbachev-Deng Xiaoping meeting. So they had all the attention. They just thought it wasn't going to happen. But the real reason the Chinese took so long to crush them was because Deng Xiaoping wanted every military leader to get blood on their hands so that there was no split. So it took them a long time to bring in troops from everywhere in China. That's why there was such a delay. We didn't know that at the time. We pieced this all together afterwards. So that night, it was the night of June 3rd, turning into June 4th. We had many false alarms. And I remember I had rented a room I split the cost with two other news organizations, the BBC and the Times of London, because we needed a place to go to work. It was very hard to go back and forth to our office because everything was blocked. All the roads were blocked. And then I was there and, I was seeing the Chinese people burning these military armored personnel carriers. I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe what I was seeing. Not a lot of violence, but they were trying to keep the army out. They were really determined to keep the army out because the students were in the square. They wanted to protect the students. And then around 1 a.m, I went back to my hotel, and which was just a block from the square, the Peking Hotel. And I had to climb over the fence. They had locked the fence. They had tied it with wire. And I don't know how I climbed it. I can't climb anything these days, but I just sort of scrambled over, walked in, and I looked Chinese, right? Huge advantage. So I see the plainclothes police frisking all the journalists as you approach the hotel. And I thought, well, I have my notebooks. So I just put them down my pants in the back. And I just walked in like, I know how to do the Chinese shuffle. So I can really look like a local going, into work. So they just ignore me. I'm become totally invisible. And I just walked in and I saw all the reporters, really excited and upset. And because the army was coming in from all four corners, right into the heart. Tiananmen is in the geographic heart of the city. So that you get it there along the main routes. And there was a lot of visiting reporters because Gorbachev had been there. And so there was a USA Today reporter talking on the phone, the payphones. They had payphones in the lobby. And the plainclothes police had these huge Chinese scissors, really good quality scissors. And he just cut the cord to the receiver. And I remember the face of the reporters. And then I went up to the room and then I watched the whole night. And the troops arrived around just about 15 minutes after I got to my room. And they came in and they were roaring down the boulevard, the tanks, the armored personnel carriers, and all the people were trying to stop them. They put the city buses sort of at right angles, like across the road. And the tanks just smashed through them like they were tin cans. And people put these, I forget what they're called, those concrete things, the barriers that keep, the bike lanes separated from the car lanes. They tried to put that across. The tanks just went over them. And there was a lot of shooting and a lot of people were wounded and killed. And what was remarkable was that ordinary people were rushing in to save them. Nothing, people couldn't compute what was happening, how dangerous it was. So they just went in to save them. And this went on until 4 a.m. So 3 hours of carnage. And then the lights went off in the square. I could see the top of the square and I could hear the loudspeakers. And that's when the soldiers ordered the students out. We didn't know what was happening. There were a couple of reporters who stayed in the square. So we know that they ordered the students out. They beat them as they left and they made them walk out. And then as they were walking, maybe 15 minutes later, some tanks tried to run them over and a few students were killed and some lost an arm. So the next day, it turns out a lot of reporters were in the hotel and we didn't know that who else was in there. And then we went down to try to get something to eat in the hotel dining room. And the waitress was saying, the chef is too upset. He's not going to cook. And so the reporters, some of us were yelling and because we had to work and we needed to eat. And so all of a sudden the chef came out and he said, okay, I'm going to feed you because you're going to tell the world what happened. And then everybody started crying including tough, cameramen, and it was really like. And then the rest of the day, we went up, and they were still cleaning, like mopping up campaign. They would shoot people who were on the street, and there were a knot of people about a block from the square screaming at the soldiers. And then every now and then the soldiers would shoot at this crowd of people, and they'd go running towards the hotel, and some of them would be shot, and they wouldn't let anyone go and rescue them. So they were like lying in front of us. I was on, I think, the 12th story. I can't remember right now. So it wasn't like on second story. I was higher up, but they were just bleeding out because they weren't allowed to be rescued. And then the tank man was on Monday morning. Sunday morning was people were screaming at the soldiers. Monday morning, everything was quiet. The army had taken control, and there was this long line of tanks going right past my hotel. And that's when the tank men came out and tried to stop them. So I saw all of that. And I remember talking to my editor and saying, I just saw this amazing scene where there's a single man. He tried to stop the tanks. And I don't know how to describe this. And she said, we have the pictures, because there were still some photographers in the hotel, and they got those shots. So that's the most famous shot of the massacre.
Thank you for that, Jan. In your 1999 film, Forbidden City, you say, I have left China many times in my life, but have not been able to stay away. How do you feel now?
I feel I have to stay away. Everything changed a couple of years ago when China grabbed the two Michaels. And for people who don't follow the minutiae of Chinese politics, what happened was this Chinese executive for Huawei landed in Vancouver. The US wanted to extradite her, so Canada arrested her. This set off a huge problem because she was the daughter of a very powerful man in China. Huawei is, I think, the biggest tech company in China. And so they grabbed two Canadians who were not really connected to anything. We call them the two Michaels because that's Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And they put them in jail, almost no consular access, very harsh conditions. And so I think I'm not alone in not wanting to go to China. You cannot know what will happen, and it's very dangerous. So I feel it's, because I'm quite outspoken, it's not a good idea for me to go. My son was studying there just before COVID, and he was taking a master's with Johns Hopkins, which has a center in Nanjing, and he was spending. And I wanted to go for the completion of his year in Nanjing, but everybody said don't go. And in the end, of course, COVID took that decision away from me. It closed down the program, and I think that Hopkins has not reopened the Nanjing Center. I think China's foreign policies are so hostile now that universities are rethinking their exchanges, businesses are rethinking their offices there and sending their executives. And I'm not going to go. Maybe never. This may be it. My last trip was for the most recent book where I wrote about family and food in 3 countries, and I think that might be my last trip. It's sad.
Actually, it is. And the first question that we have from our audience was that 1972 was 50 years ago. And have you been able to travel frequently to visit family and friends, which you've in fact answered.
Yeah.
And that is very sad because it was such a part of your maturing as a journalist. I'm going to invite the audience to please put in their questions and say, but it's also very interesting that you just mentioned your cooking book, which I read as well, which is more than recipes. It's also an insight into culture. While we're waiting to see what people might have to ask you, I'm wondering if you might speak to some of the other work that you've done in terms of cultural reporting and your work as a columnist and as a university professor. And please,
Okay.
everybody, feel free to submit your question in the Q&A.
I think I've been to China many times. I actually don't keep track of how many times, but I've been many, many times. And of course, if you're a correspondent, you're going in and out. So does that count as a trip? Not really, because you're based there. So I don't know how many times I've gone, but I haven't gone since that last book. I spent a total of 12 years in China, 6 as a student and 6 as a foreign correspondent. And then I've written several books about China, which involved going back. Like you mentioned that this young woman wanted me to help her go to the US, and then I turned her in. And so I wrote a book about trying to find her. I think 2006, I went back to try to find her. She was someone I really didn't know who had approached me and the American Chinese girl who was also studying. I call us girls. We were 19. We were there, and she saw us as all powerful and able to help her get out. And we were a complete, left-wing ardent Maoists, and we were horrified that she wanted to go out, and we didn't know anything. And so we told our teachers, and then I totally forgot until I was writing my first book, Red China Blues, and I read my diaries. And then of course, I knew, oh my God, this is very bad. I had that hindsight, which I didn't have at that time. I was just this starry-eyed student who didn't know much about China, and neither did Erica. So anyway, I wrote that book it's called Comrades Lost and Found. And I wrote about looking for her and to make amends, really, for what I'd done. And so my other work, and then I was a business reporter for many years, working at the Montreal Gazette as a shipping reporter, and then the Boston Globe as a banking reporter, and then the Wall Street Journal as a banking reporter and mutual fund. So it's very odd. Then I was hired at the Globe and Mail as a business reporter. And I have to say, business reporting was great training for reporting on the Communist Party, because corporations are very similar. They're very secretive. They're very image conscious. The chairman is all powerful and everyone sucks up to the chairman. So I found it very compatible with China reporting. But, and then later I became a features writer for the Globe and Mail. And I had a lunch column where I have the book here. It's on my shelf because I often have to look things up. So this is Lunch With. I had so much fun. I think I did that about 6 years, 7 years. I took out celebrities and trashed them. I had the best time. Anyway.
So following up on that is perfect segue to the next question, which is loved lunch with Jan. How are the people chosen to be interviewed, and were they really terrified?
Oh, okay. So I'll hold this up since see what I used to look like before I got old. A lot of them asked me to take them to lunch. It's so crazy. They have publicists and they just want some ink. So what I would do is I would look for somebody that was interesting. It had to be interesting. And they didn't have to be a celebrity. I took out a beggar who worked on the corner of Wellesley and Yonge. Actually, my aunt told me about her. She said, she's really nice. She's really cheerful. Why don't you take her to lunch? And she was really interesting because she was fake. She had a electric wheelchair, but she wasn't disabled. She had this wheelchair, but she was wonderful. She told me everything. And, you could argue that she was a bright light on the corner, and she greeted everyone. She made a ton of money. She opened up all her accounts to me so I could see it. I took her to a really fancy restaurant in Toronto. We had a very good time. I really liked her. I didn't trash her. And the restaurant was very, very respectful of her. She, wore stained stretch pants and an old hockey sweater with, pills all, and I dressed down too. And we went to, I don't know if you remember, there's a fancy restaurant on Yonge, north of Eglinton, called Central. It's no longer there, but it was very fancy. and they were extremely polite and gracious. So, but I chose people. Usually, they'd had a career like Suzanne Summers, and now they were flogging something like their thigh masters, and so that would just be wonderful for me. Only a few people refused, like Martha Stewart. That broke my heart. She had a very smart publicist. The stupid publicists would just book their clients without realizing the risk to their client. But Martha Stewart obviously paid enough, and she got a smart cookie. And so that person said no. That was sad. And for instance, I took out Brian Adams. He's so narcissistic, and he's such a hypocrite because he said he was a vegan. And so I don't say anything. I just watch what he orders. And then he ordered pizza with cheese. So he said, I thought you were a vegan. And then he said, oh, I'm going to pick it off. And then, of course, I watch him eat the whole thing. And I don't have to say anything. I just write it. So, and I had nice people too. I'm going to look in my book. I was nice to some people. Margaret Atwood, since you're a library, I have to tell you, she's terrible. And she was the prototype. I was a nice reporter until Margaret Atwood crossed my path. And then she was coming out with Alias Grace, and she refused to do any interview with the Globe and Mail. And so we had a books reporter, a wonderful, wonderful journalist named Val Ross. And so Val wrote her whole, big story without Margaret Atwood because she refused an interview. And at the last minute, Margaret Atwood phoned the editor and said, okay, I'll do the interview. At which point Val Ross said, I'm not doing that. I already finished my story. So they said, well, they looked at me. It was Labor Day weekend. I don't have a cottage. I answered the phone. And so they said, you do it. So I dutifully did it. She was quite nasty. But I wrote a nice, typical, author comes out with new book, boring. And I gave it to my editor. It was just the way you see everybody's article about an author with a new book. And my editor said, this is boring. Tell me what she's really like. And I went, oh, okay. I'll tell you that. I went early. I ordered a few finger foods so we wouldn't waste any time. And she came over and said, I don't want to sit here. It's too exposed. I want to sit there. And I said, that's smoking. And I know you don't smoke. It was her restaurant. It was her favorite restaurant. And then it deteriorated from there. I said, so I don't understand why you grew up in the bush. She said, I'm not a Margaret Atwood specialist. I did read every page of Alias Grace over that long weekend, stayed up till 3 a.m. But I didn't, it's pre-internet, so I couldn't pull the clips on her. I didn't know why she grew up in the bush. So I said, and it was in the press release. How come you grew up in the bush? And she said, look it up in the file. She could have just said, my father was an entomologist, would it kill you? But so that was so much fun. And then my editor said, and then readers loved it. And my editor said, let's do this every week. And I said, okay, good. I get to go out and eat lunch every week.
Well, if you ever pick up that gig again, Jan, I'm in for lunch.
Okay.
And I will be happy with wherever you choose and wherever you sit us.
Yeah, it's so much fun, because you just watch. You don't have to do anything. How people behave in a restaurant is very telling, like Lynn Johnston, for better or for worse, the cartoonist. She was criticizing the poor waitress that she didn't smile enough. Like, she's a spaghetti factory. We were in the spaghetti factory. What do you want? And she even wrote on a comment card, the service was surly. And it wasn't. But of course, I went to town on that. And I phoned the restaurant the next day to say the waitress was fine. Just ignore this person. So anyway, sorry, I'm answering too long.
No, actually, this is fascinating for me. By the way, if our viewers haven't read Alias Grace, it's actually a wonderful book, as
Yeah.
are most of Margaret Atwood's. But this behind story is just amazing, Jan. Thank you for the insights. Our next question from one of our audience members is, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on the comparison of what's happening in Russia and your view of China.
Yes. Okay. So they're both dictatorships, right? The difference is Putin doesn't have a lot of money, but he has oil. And they have an alliance. China, Xi Jinping is the president of China and the chairman of the party. So Xi Jinping and Putin have an alliance because they see that they need to be allies against the superpower, which is the US. So if you follow the minutiae of Chinese politics, you might remember that Putin and Xi Jinping had a little meeting, a summit, in which they declared everlasting love and support to each other. And Xi Jinping wanted Putin to postpone the invasion of Ukraine until after the end of the Beijing Olympics. So if you remember that, he did. He waited until the Olympics finished with their grand finale, because the Chinese love this stuff. They think it's so important for their status in the world community. They don't feel sure of themselves because they're not elected. They feel the insecurity of that every dictator feels, like maybe everybody hates me, insecurity. And so these big circuses like the Olympics are very important to them. They think this gives them validation. So Xi Jinping didn't want Putin to take away the headlines until the Olympics finished with their big flourish. So Putin waited. And by the time he invaded Ukraine, if you'll remember, his armored vehicles got bogged down in the mud because the spring thaw was arriving. So it was like a really dumb thing. But these two feel they need to support each other. And recently, like a week ago, I think, the two leaders met, I think in Kazakhstan or Tajikistan, I can't remember where they met. And Xi Jinping actually, quote, expressed concerns about the war in Ukraine because Putin has had many military setbacks. And China, of course, wants to be allied with a winner. Interestingly enough, when Xi Jinping talked to the media, gave his press conference, he didn't mention Ukraine. But when Putin talked, he said China has concerns. And that was very curious to me. Why would Putin reveal this if China didn't? But it showed me that there's cracks. And of course, the Ukraine situation has affected China. They're afraid of sanctions. They're afraid of all the restrictions that are imposed. The Chinese economy is in trouble right now, partly because of the world supply chain problems, but also COVID, right? COVID has really knocked China sideways. So I think it's really interesting to see how the relationship is going to evolve. But Xi Jinping is about to have the 20th Party Congress in October 16th. So in 2 weeks, two weeks and a bit, the Party Congress is going to open. What does that mean? Well, it's basically a big show. Everything has been organized in advance. The party is way more important than the government of China. The party controls everything. All of this has been hashed out in July at party meetings at this resort called Beidaihe, which is on the seashore. They all go there. It's all secret. They hash out who's going to get what. And then at this party congress, every 5 years, they have this. We'll find out who the new leaders are. Xi Jinping for sure is going to get a third term, pretty well sure, which is unprecedented. He's not supposed to. They have a rule. He's too old. He's so old, he's a year younger than I am. That's how old he is. So he's not supposed to get a third term. And so just so you know, he's 69, I'm 70. But you figured that out, right? 50 years since I went to China. So he's So this is the key. If you really want to know what's happening, look at the age of the standing committee. What's the standing committee? So you have the central committee. These are all the party elite. Then on top of that, you have the standing committee of the central, sorry, you have the central committee. Above them, you have the standing committee. And above that, you have the Politburo. And the Politburo is usually 7 men. They're always men. And they run everything. So the key to look for is what's the age of the members of the Politburo? If they're all old, that means Xi Jinping is not grooming a successor. I think he's not grooming a successor because he doesn't want anybody breathing down his neck. And this is very unusual. Usually in China, halfway through the second term, you're only allowed 2 terms. Halfway through the second term, you're supposed to designate someone as your successor. Well, they're all really old. He's made it so they're all old, so there's no successor. And now he's going into his 3rd term. So it's a very unusual time, and he's got a lot of crises. He's got COVID crises and he's got economic crises. So I think China is going to be really interesting in the next year.
I'm going to not go in order of the questions because I want to take one that picks up on what you're saying right now. One of our guests asks, do you have any opinion about the current Chinese regime?
I think they're really bad and shocking how harsh they are to Hong Kong. It's just stunning to me that they took a very vibrant former colony and they've just crushed the lifeblood out of it. They're even going after, is he a bishop? He's 90 years old. They're going after him. They're going after the protesters. They're going after people who held up a blank piece of paper. They're going after the journalists. And it's kind of stunning to me. I always thought, like at the end of Red China Blues, I talk about the wealth of China, how people are becoming more prosperous, that there's the middle class. And I always thought that the development of a middle class would mean a push towards individualism and by extension, democracy. Because democracy consists of people who want their voice heard. And instead, I'm seeing this kind of totalitarian a dictatorship where everything is controlled, where he's going for a 3rd term when he's not supposed to, when there's surveillance on every street corner, which has its positive side, but a big negative side. Like people don't run red lights in China because they will get you. And if you get enough negative points, you won't be able to buy a plane ticket. Like they keep track of all your demerits. So I think he's really shockingly harsh and stupidly harsh. I don't know why he's doing what he's doing to Tibet and of course to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Like, what is the point of this? Why are you setting up concentration camps and shoving these people into these camps and forcing them to learn, the Marxist dogma? Why are you doing this? Why are you oppressing them? Because history has taught us that if you push people around, they're going to fight back. They're going to become more nationalistic, more proud of their culture and their religion, whereas before they might have been more, relaxed about everything. So I don't understand it. And also, China keeps talking about wanting to get Taiwan back in the so-called, country. Well, Taiwan is looking with horror at what is happening to Hong Kong. And so any possibility that Taiwan would want to reunite with the mainland is completely dead. Like, that's just gone. And instead, what you have is the US saying, if you invade Taiwan, Biden said this, that like, we're going to support them with militarily. And then the White House backed away from that and said, oh, no, he didn't really mean that, because you're not supposed to say it. But I don't think he's stupid. I think he said it and then they took it back. So you get to say it without being held responsible. So I am surprised how harsh China has become.
We have a question on a different part of your writing career, and I remember this as well. Hi, Jan. Am I right in remembering that you once wrote an expose for the Globe on women who cleaned private homes, the work, the harsh chemicals, the low pay, by actually getting one of the jobs yourself to research the article? If so, can you comment on that experience?
That was one of the most interesting stories I did. An editor had said the minimum wage is going up, I think by 25%, 25 cents in February. Can you write about this? And so I thought about it and I thought, well, I don't want to just do a man in the street interview people. What do you think? I said, I want to go and I think I should do a month, because a month is a nice economic period. You pay monthly rent, monthly utility. It just made sense. A week was dilettantish. A lot of politicians do this stupid thing for a week. That's not good enough. But more than a month, they would kill me, right? I'm not allowed to spend that much time on a story. And then I started doing the research and I said, okay, so the poverty model in Canada is one mother and two children, single mother, two children. And I said to my husband, I need two children. And he said, well, you have two kids. And I said, oh. And so I asked my kids, they said, I told them, I said, would you go with me on this project? And they said they didn't have any choice. I thought I asked them. And we went, and then I had to get a basement apartment, a cheap apartment. Wow, I couldn't believe the rent. And that was a long time. It was 2006. It was really hard to get anything affordable even then. I found this place and it was in the basement. And my kids stayed at their regular school. But the school, they go to Toronto French School, which is a private school. So you can just imagine the classmates. And some of them didn't know what was happening. And they thought that I had suddenly become really poor because I wasn't telling a lot of people what I was. And so I remember one father opened up the trunk of his Mercedes and gave canned goods to my son. And he brought them back. But frankly, we really needed the food because I barely had enough money. And I know how to cook. I know how to make beans and rice and, use bones and stuff. I know all that, and was really bad. And what I loved was working with the other cleaners. And I also liked going into people's homes and seeing how they treated us. Like there was a home where we walked in and there was dog poop right in the middle of the foyer. And we worked as a team. We were an agency. And I said to the other maid, I said, what is this? Like, why don't they pick it up? And she said, I'll do it. And she said, oh, it's very light. That means it's been here for several days and they just left it for us to pick up. I was like, whoa, I can't believe this. I can't believe this. I can't believe how people treated us. Like there were homes where we'd go in and the other maid would drop her coat on the floor right in front of the coat closet. And I sort of look at her like, why don't we hang up our coat? And she said, because we're not allowed to open the closet or go in. And I remember we went to one house and we did that. And the guy was home. He said, what are you doing? And he picked it up off the floor and he hung it up for us. And then he said, would you like some coffee? And I went, oh my God, he was the only one who offered us coffee. So I said, yes. The other said, oh, no, it's okay. I said, no, I love coffee. And he was a school teacher. I thought, it's so interesting. It's a school teacher who gives me coffee and hangs up our coats. And those other people who are really rich, they let us drop our coats on the floor. So I really loved that, that I learned a lot. And I learned also how to clean. I learned that you can pull all the knobs off the stove. So I can clean now very well. I learned a lot. And I also learned that I don't clutter up my bathtub rim. That really drove me crazy. We had to clean the bathtub and people have 14 bottles of shampoo. And you have to put it on the floor. You have to clean everything. You got to wipe the bottom of everything so there's you don't get any muck on the bottom. And people told me after that they also stopped leaving all these bottles of step on their bathtub. People really got a lot out of that story, I think, because I was talking about the invisibility of certain people who work. And the interesting thing was these were not immigrants. These were Canadians who had low self-esteem, no skills. The only reason you work for an agency is if you don't know how to hustle. Because they take a big cut. So if you were enterprising, you would not work for an agency. These are people who didn't have driver's licenses, who didn't have bank accounts, who felt so helpless. They didn't know how to take the TTC. This was a whole new world to me. And it really changed my thinking on poverty and hopelessness and, what a terrible cycle it is and we worked so hard. Like, I was really tired, and I got carpal tunnel within about 5 or 6 days, which to this day I still have a problem. My fingertips started buzzing right away because I was repetitive stress, right? We were scrubbing, and I was shocked and they all had it. All the maids had carpal tunnel. And I was diagnosed afterwards. I mean, I didn't make up my diagnosis. I was diagnosed with carpal tunnel, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop the project, so I had to keep working. Anyway, I really loved it.
Our questions are very wide because the breadth of your life experience is so very wide. So moving from this episode into another question, what do you see happening for Taiwan?
I think Taiwan will try to remain independent, its own country, but it's really difficult because it's so close to China. And I think they're linked with some communications cables to the mainland under the Straits of Taiwan. They do a lot of business with China. It just depends on international relations, I think. They are forging their own country, but it's so tiny compared to China. I mean, we're Canada and we're beside the US and we're about 35 million and they're 300 million, but they're not menacing us. And I forget the population of Taiwan. I think I just can't remember. It's like 30, 50, I don't remember, but it's tiny. It's tiny if you consider that the city of Chengdu is like 30, 40 million, right? Guangdong province, I think, is 300 million. I mean, it's just ridiculous to try to withstand. So I don't know. I think Taiwan is in a precarious position. If at any time China feels like it could be disastrous. And that's why watching Ukraine is very interesting. China's watching the world reaction to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And they're watching with worry because the sanctions came immediately. The public opinion is very strong. I mean, you've got some wishy-washy countries Israel hasn't really helped. I believe they have. I may be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Israel has helped Ukraine. I don't think Germany has done much. But for the most part, the international community is doing what it can, and with surprising vigor and enthusiasm. And so I think China's watching this very carefully. But, how much is moral suasion going to help with a country that grabs 2 Michaels off the street? Right? It's pretty hard to say.
So going back to the earlier part of your career, which in many ways fits with our One Book, One Aurora, swimming back to Trout River, we have a question here of somebody wanting you to explain about the re-education camps, why the government sent people to the re-education camps. Could you speak to that, please?
So I don't know if you mean the re-education camps today in Xinjiang or you mean during the Cultural Revolution. I'm going to assume you mean today. And I'm going to answer using the historical comparison. So during the early years of the communist rule. So they took power in 1949. So throughout the 50s, there were these really big political campaigns. And what were they really about? They were about power struggles at the top. And so they would grab certain people who revealed that they had different ideas, and they would ship them off to re-education camps. And one of the most famous periods was during the anti-rightist movement in 1959, I think, 59, 60. And of course, the Cultural Revolution was major. And in the Cultural Revolution, everybody got sent down. You either got sent down without as non-punishing, which is what happened to my classmates and me. We went down in 1975. We left the campus at Peking University. I told you I was an official government exchange student in the 70s. I went for 3 years of official exchange. We went down. That was not a punishment. It was supposed to be wonderful. Of course, my classmates hated it, but it was not a punishment. But we were side by side with a penal colony, a penal farm, and we would watch them do the same thing that we were doing, but they were prisoners. And so those re-education camps were isolating people from their families, giving them, brainwashing them in whatever ideology you wanted, and making them do physical labor. And so it's very hard. It's like being in a prison. Our camp where we went wasn't a camp, but we called it a farm. We also were there. We couldn't leave. We weren't allowed to leave. And it was pretty grinding. And, you know, I was really tired and didn't have enough food. And I couldn't see a big difference between punishment and what we were doing. And so today, the re-education camps are vast. And China at first denied it, but thanks to some very good journalists and some very brave people in Xinjiang, we know that there are these camps. And now the satellite photos show that they built these huge camps. And what they're trying to do is make these, they're an ethnic minority. They're called the Uyghurs, and they're a Muslim minority, predominantly Muslim. They want them to speak Mandarin, not speak their language, the Uyghur language. They want them to not follow their religion. They want to stamp out their religion and the culture. The children are split up from the families. It's like unbelievable that this is happening. And why are they doing this? Originally, after 9/11, China took advantage of this whole anti-terrorism thing to crack down on the Muslims. Now, there were like 10 terrorists. There were a couple. And they took advantage of this to tighten their grip on this area. It's in the northwest of China. The Silk Road used to go through there, which is why you have these Turkic minorities. They're Turkic. So they don't necessarily look like me. They might have blue eyes. They might have even light colored hair. They would not have Asian features. And they have their complete own culture. And China wanted to control them, I think, because they're a border region. Like, I don't really know. To me, it doesn't make any sense. The fact that you had 10 terrorists is not a reason to do this to the whole region. It's very expensive to set up these camps. It's very bad PR. And the net result is they're all going to hate you. So why would you do this? I don't understand, but I think dictators often do things like this. They just do this because they're afraid that if they don't crush these people, they don't bring them to heal, then they might get ideas of breaking away. But they didn't. They don't have any separatism movement there. At least nothing significant. Anyway, so that's why it's really hard for me to explain it and make you understand that, oh, well, that Now I understand, because to me, it's not understandable at all.
Um, this is interesting, I think. How do you think that the internet and worldwide communication among younger people will impact communism?
Well, communists are very afraid of the internet. And how does it impact young people? They get more news. They are not completely limited to what the government says. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the Great Firewall of China. And so they do censor everything that they can. Like, you can't get anything about the Tiananmen massacre. It was more than 30 years ago. You still, tank man, nothing. But you can get something called a VPN, which is a virtual private network. You pay for it. And if you use this, it makes it look like you're in New York or something looking at the internet. So it's a way to sneak around it. So people do this all the time in China. And they're very sophisticated now in terms of the internet, and their cell phones and their laptops is very advanced. You can use the internet everywhere in China. We were just having some problems before we started with spotty connections with one of the people organizing this. That would never happen in China. They have the best internet. The only thing is they slow it down. Like, if you want to look at the New York Times website, you can't. It's very slow. But you can go in the Gobi Desert. You can go in a parking garage, 4 stories down. You can be on a high-speed train. You can be on the subway. You can get perfect reception. And this, I'm talking 10 years ago, you could do this. So they get the news. The thing is, are they unhappy? I don't really know. You don't really know in the country unless you have a way to find out people's opinions. So we don't know what the young people really think. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with working hard. They don't want to work like their parents worked. They want to take it easy. A lot of them don't want to get married. They're not following in this, pattern that, get married, have kids. They're not doing that. I think it's very hard to say what they want. A lot of them are coming here and not going back. That should tell you something, right? That should tell you. We look around here in Canada, and people are staying. They're leaving. They're not going back. So very hard to say what people really think. And even when you can have elections, right? We have elections and we vote for Doug Ford, but do we really vote for Doug Ford? If you look at the statistics, it's a small percentage of people. It's because of our system where we have multiple parties, and so this person can get in, just like in Italy. Is Italy fascist? No, it's not. If you look at the number of people who voted, it's a small group, but it was enough for them to what's the name of the party? The Fratelli Italia, I think that's what it's called. So even in a democracy, it's hard to know what people really think, even with our elections. What do people think in Ontario? It's pretty hard to know, even though this is who we elected. In China, it's even more opaque. I don't think you know. I don't know what young people think. I think the internet is definitely a good thing, though.
So the next question, is political. With the Chinese militarization and new facilities they're building in the South Chinese Sea, do you see them trying to take control over that part of the world, threatening not only US forces, but the Pacific Rim and Australia? And our guest says, I wonder if this is a possible first step to reclaiming Taiwan.
Yes, very good question. And I totally agree with you. So China wants to claim this, the China Seas, the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands. So that's a foreign name for it. And the Chinese have their own name for it. And they're building islands. They're like putting sand there and having outposts. And yes, they want it because probably there's oil, there's resources. They don't want anyone else there. And they're not the only ones. Like Vietnam wants it, the Philippines wants it, Japan wants it. And so there is this sort of scramble to see who can claim this. That will be a flashpoint, I think. And yes, I think it's part of the whole, Taiwan. They really want Taiwan. They want Taiwan. It's so interesting, this whole idea of what's a nation. At what point do you draw the boundaries? Like, is Taiwan part of China? For a long time I think it was a Japanese colony. The Portuguese occupied it. Just like Tibet, right? Is Tibet part of China? Well, China would say, yes, it is. But is it really? At what era do you actually draw the boundaries? Like, this is the Ukrainian question too. What is Ukraine? Like today, Putin claimed 4 territories, and he had the so-called referendum where people had to vote at gunpoint, and I think they dropped their ballots into transparent boxes. I mean, and then he goes, okay, so this is our territory, meaning now if Ukraine attacks them, Ukraine's invading Russia. You can't make this stuff up. It's really, really like 1984. Everything is topsy-turvy. So the fact that China's building islands, like they're dredging the sand and they're making islands and they're making soldiers go live there, is really, you can't make it up. You wouldn't believe this. In fact, there's a new book out about this. It's a novel, and it's called Nine Dash Line. Do I have it? I think I gave it as a gift. It's I'm sorry, I'm so bad with names. She just had her book launch in September. Sorry, I can't remember, but it's a really fun book, and she writes about, it's kind of a book about an American secret agent and a Chinese guy who's being punished. And his punishment is he has to go to this island and dig it up. And it's really a fun book. 9 Line, I think it's called, by Emily, sorry.
Well, from what usually happens when we're online, one of our attendees is going to be Googling it, and it'll probably show up in the Q&A.
I love Google.
The next question, it's interesting because our guest asked about the special residential school system for Indian children in Canada, which I think is an interesting point, especially where we are right now with September 30th coming up, and wants to know, is it the same phobia of people of a different race or ethnicity that can't be trusted at work? Is it the same type of thing as experienced in China?
Well, when I was in China in the 70s and the 80s, I didn't sense ethnic tension. Mao's whole idea was, we are united, we are all one people, and there were special considerations given to ethnic minorities. What do I mean? I mean that, for instance, in my class at Peking University, in my history class, and I mean the one that I went to where I got my history degree, I was in a Chinese class. We had several minorities, and including a woman from Xinjiang, a Uyghur woman. Now, it was kind of offensive because every time we had a party, they would make her dance, her ethnic dance. So she's really good at it, and she didn't seem to mind. And, there didn't seem to be any hatred. And certainly the university had special dining rooms for Muslims. They were very respectful of their dietary limits. They had their own food, and they would never be served anything that would be tainted by pork. I mean, there was a lot of respect. And then, because Mao kept preaching, we're all one family, we're all together. And I went to Tibet. We weren't allowed to go, but I sneaked in as a reporter. And I felt hostility to me because people thought I was an ethnic Chinese. Some people were hostile, especially the monks. Uh, but I also spoke to Tibetan people who lived there and worked there, and it was very interesting because they did not hate the Chinese. They had intermarriage with the Chinese, and the offspring could choose the ethnicity that they wanted. You could choose on your identity card whether you wanted to be classified as Tibetan or as Chinese. They didn't call you Tibetan Chinese. You would pick one. And what I found amazing is they wanted to pick Tibetan. Why? We know that in the South of the United States before the Civil Rights Movement, Blacks who could pass as whites sometimes did because it was such a difference. If they were light skinned and they could pass, they would. But in Tibet, anybody who was mixed Tibetan Chinese would choose Tibetan on their identity card. And the reason they did is because they could own land in Tibet. Han Chinese like me, I'm not like me, I'm Canadian, but Han Chinese could not own land. Tibetans could get into university with lower points. There was an affirmative action, whereas it's super hard for Han Chinese to get in. They would have a lower threshold for Tibetans, and they got higher salaries than their counterparts. They got extra bonuses. I forget the others, but they picked it. So it wasn't like it was a horrible thing to be Tibetan. If you could escape being Tibetan and be Chinese, this was your chance, and they didn't. They chose to be Tibetan. But I think a lot of that has changed. And what happened in the 80s and the 90s is the Chinese moved in to Lhasa. They saw it as a place to make money. They were looking all over China. It wasn't particular to Lhasa. They went to every place, seeing anywhere where there weren't businesses opened up yet, they flooded in. But the problem was they became the business people in Tibet, and the Tibetans were not running their own economy. And so then the resentment grew. And of course, China is so paranoid about the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism. They don't want any rival organization. And so they crush them. And as I said, whenever you crush someone, that you get this reaction, like if you're getting oppressed. Mao had a quote about this: wherever there is oppression, there is resistance. And he was right. There's a whole resistance movement now in Tibet. So I forget what the question was. I'm just rambling. Sorry.
It was a comparison between what's happened in Canada with the residential schools.
Sorry. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So these re-education camps in Xinjiang are very reminiscent now of that, where they're taking the kids away from the parents and they're making the kids learn Mandarin. They're splitting up the families. So yeah. So no one ever learns, right? Like we have this example in Canada, don't do that. And the Chinese are they criticize us. If Canada criticizes them, then they say, well, you did this in the residential schools, which means that China does know what happened. And yet they're not learning from it. They're just doing it all over again. So there is a direct parallel between what Canada did to its Indigenous people and what China's doing to its minorities. That's a good question.
Thank you. Now, you referred to some of this when you were speaking now, and I don't know if it's something that you can explain briefly, but one of our guests would like to know, what is the difference between the Han, Manchu, and Mongol Chinese?
So Han Chinese count for 97%, 98% of all People's Republic of China people. And they are like me, we're ethnic, what you think of as a Chinese person. We're called Han Chinese. Our written language is Chinese. Whether we speak Cantonese or Sichuan dialect or Shanghainese, we're considered Chinese. And in Chinese, you say Han, or the Han. And they get that from, I think, the second big dynasty, the Han Dynasty. That's where the word comes from. The Mongols are barbarians. That's what they used to call them. They're the barbarians who are on the northern border of China in what is today Mongolia. Now, Mongolia has what you call Outer Mongolia, which is called the People's Republic of Mongolia, or the Mongolian People's Republic. I can't remember the official, which word comes. So that's where Ulaanbaatar is. And was a Soviet satellite republic. And they were not friendly with Beijing because they were part of the Soviet sphere. And then you have Inner Mongolia, which borders Outer Mongolia. And that is one of the border territories of China. Like Xinjiang is there on the far west, and Mongolia is sort of next to it. Very similar. Those are Mongolians, and they're considered a minority, an ethnic minority in China. They're about 3%. So you have Mongolians, you have Tibetans, you have what they call Dai, D-A-I, which is really Thai. It's the Thai ethnicity. You have all these others. Okay, so the Manchus are from Manchuria. They're also considered barbarians. And when I say barbarians, I'm talking about the Qing dynasty terminology. That's why they built the Great Wall, was to keep out the Mongols and the Manchus, because they're barbarians. They're not Han Chinese. They speak another language. And Mongols, of course, conquered the world on horseback. And they conquered China too. And they were the Yuan dynasty. Genghis Khan was the grandfather of, I think Kublai Khan, and if I've got it right. And they formed the Yuan dynasty, and they were in the Forbidden City in Beijing. And then the Ming dynasty, which was Han, overthrew the Mongols. And they were also in the Forbidden City in Beijing, if you've ever been there. And then the last dynasty were the Manchus. If you've heard of the last emperor, he was Manchu. Manchuria is in northeast China, if you've got your geography right. So Xinjiang, far west, Mongolia, center, and then Manchu is the east, northeast. And they have their own language, their own customs. And so they were the last conquering dynasty in China. So what were they like? To make sure, because we look the same, right? You can't really tell the difference. We all look Asian. So what they wanted to do was they made the Chinese men have a pigtail, like a braid. They shaved the front of their head and this braid in the back, the pigtail. That was a sign of subservience. You were the Han, you were lower than the Manchu. And if you cut off your braid, you would get your head cut off. So, and the women did not bind their feet. Manchu women did not bind their feet. They had regular sized feet, but they liked the way the Chinese women had these dainty little feet. So they had these funny shoes. You can see them at the Bata Shoe Museum. So they have these regular sized feet, and then they had like a platform shoe, but the base of the platform was like, what would I say? Like a cone. It was like, I'm looking for something on my desk. It was just like a lump in the middle. And so they'd sort of walk like this as if you were bound feet. And that's how you differentiated the Manchu women. And they were overthrown in 1910, 1911. And then the Republic of China was established. No more emperors. The last dynasty, the Manchus, were really weakened by Western imperialism. They had to fight the Opium Wars, invasion by the British, the French, the Western powers. And the Opium Wars, of course, the British were drug dealers. They were looking for a product that would addict China. So because China didn't need anything. And Britain wanted the silk and the tea. And the coffers of Britain were getting drained. All the silver was draining. And so they looked for a product that the Chinese couldn't say no to. And they grew it in India and shipped it to China. And they addicted a whole nation. And the Chinese emperor, the Manchus, were weak. They were already a century into their power, and they were all decadent, and they couldn't fight. And that's why Hong Kong was part of the reparations. China lost 2 opium wars, and in one of them they had to give up Hong Kong. So when you see what China is doing today to Hong Kong, you have to understand there's this history. They hate Western imperialism. So, and they don't like the Hong Kong Chinese much because they speak with British accents and they're all hoity-toity, and they believe in the rule of law, and they like the, judges and stuff like that. So they don't like the Hong Kong Chinese. And it all has this underlay of, you were a colony, we had to give you up because they addicted us with drugs. If you don't know history, you don't understand a lot of why they behave the way they do today. Anyways, now Manchuria is just the 3 northern provinces of China, like, let's see, Liaoning. Now I'm going to forget them all, but there's 3 provinces in the northeast, and they're the industrial area. They have coal mines there and stuff like that. Can't remember anything. I'm at the stage of life where I can't remember, nouns. So well, that's the answer.
Actually, it's also very interesting for me because one reason why we chose our One Book, One Aurora, Swim Back to Trout River, is I personally love fiction that has its basis in history, because that makes me want to look further into the history that I might have missed when I was in school. And so I really do appreciate the summary that you just gave to the viewers' question, because it also sets the book in context to the politics and the history. And thank you for that. I'm going to take one question before we close out. I'm going to answer this question because you've been working so hard. And the question was, will the Aurora Library be getting Jan's book with the interviews at lunch? So I know we had the book because I read it. I've read all of your books, and I've been a member of the Aurora Public Library for 40 plus years. And so if some of the books have gone missing and they're still in print, we will be certain to get them in, because there's obviously an appetite for everything that you have written. As our evening comes to an end, I want to thank you so much for a fascinating conversation that went all over the place. And thank you for moving with us and with our viewers. I want to thank Lucy Frechette for her tech support this evening. And most especially, I want to thank our guests for spending your evening with us. You can find other One Book, One Aurora events on our website at www.onebookoneaurora.com. Good night, everybody, and stay safe. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions. Good night.